on the salt marshes of Connecticut, lives a seemingly insignificant bird that is subject to tiny yet incremental changes in its environment, which begs an urgent question: how do we measure such change? This bird is a canary in the mine for humanity in these low-lying coastal areas.
So saltmarsh sparrows that we study are really vulnerable to nest flooding, especially on particularly high tides that coincide with the full moon and the new moon. And so these so-called spring tides push the water level up even higher than it would normally be. And with sea level rise, the peak of those tides is getting higher and higher. So the nests are more likely to get flooded, and that results in fewer young surviving. If they continue on this same trajectory, the population will be extinct sometime in the middle of the century. We're trying to find ways to do something about that. And that requires both that we understand the nature of flooding, how it affects the birds, how it makes them particularly vulnerable, where in the marsh nests are more likely to survive versus less likely to survive. And that's largely driven by the elevation of the marsh. The same information is also important for trying to understand things that we can do in order to help the sparrows. A lot of organizations are trying to do marsh restoration work to raise the elevation relative to the sea level. And one way to do that is to add sediment to the marshes. The amount of sediment that's added is relatively small, and so if we want to track whether that work is successful or not, we need to be able to measure that elevation, because it's possible that the sediment will just get washed away, that it will erode over time. And so being able to get this higher resolution data that gets us down to just a few centimeters of resolution would really be a game changer in a lot of ways, because it would allow us to more accurately distinguish places where nests are going to be successful versus those where they're not. It will help us refine our ability to identify the places where birds are going to nest in the marsh. And for the restoration work, it will really help us much better assess the success of these projects, which cost a fair amount of money to put in place. And so we really want to make sure that they work and work over the long term. Testing that, understanding that requires that we know that sediment stays where we put it, or if it doesn't stay where we put it, that enough stays in those places to keep the elevation at a level where it's going to help the birds.
Whiteout Solutions is a software development and data acquisition company. We provide services that collect data, specifically focusing on LiDAR, and we also provide software and hosted solutions for processing and analyzing that data. We've built out several products. One specifically is called GeoSap, which allows you to host the data and information, specifically point cloud and 3D modeling data, but it also gives you the ability to do analysis with those data sets and share the results of those analysis. We've been working with the University of Connecticut to do coastal erosion and marshland mapping and restoration project to help quantify and validate environmental impact from rising sea levels on the marshland, really heavily looking at the elevation impact of the rising tides, and to assist with the sediment restoration plot verification. By doing multiple data set collections, you can do change detection to actually visualize and model the change over time and be able to identify on a mass scale the elevation changes of those sediment restoration areas.
And so we get very focused on the sparrows, but it's important to remember that it's not just about the sparrows. The sparrows are just emblematic of this larger set of changes that are happening in the ecosystem and in coastal systems all over the world. And many other birds are affected in similar ways, as are other animals and plants that live in these coastal habitats. But also there's a link to human lives. Coastal areas are increasingly vulnerable to storm surges, and to increased flooding of roads and human infrastructure on these high tides. And so what is affecting these birds is also affecting people in somewhat different ways, but nonetheless in ways that have huge economic consequences and huge consequences for people's lives. And so these sparrows are really kind of give us insight into these bigger picture issues that really matter to human society.